Ed Warren's final investigations, the last cases of a legend after 5 decades confronting the demonic. Ed Warren's final years brought one last chapter of courage against the darkness. Long before the cameras arrived, before the films transformed their lives into cinematic legend, Ed and Lorraine Warren walked into darkness armed with nothing more than faith, conviction, and an unshakable belief that what they were doing mattered. By the time the 21st century dawned across the quiet hills of Monroe, Connecticut, that walk had extended across more than 50 years, thousands of cases, and a journey that had taken 2 people from curious beginners to the most recognized paranormal investigators in American history. The New England Society for Psychic Research, founded in 1952 in the modest framework of their shared commitment, had grown into an institution of international reputation. Its case archive contained documentation of phenomena that spanned every category of paranormal experience known to Western tradition. Its lecture legacy included hundreds of university appearances where Ed and Lorraine had presented their findings to audiences that ranged from skeptical to fascinated to deeply afraid. Its network of clergy, academic professionals, and community relationships had made the NESBR the preeminent paranormal research organization in the United States. Ed Warren, who had survived the skepticism of academia, the hostility of professional debunkers, the legal complications that had shadowed several of the organization's most public cases, and the sheer physical demands of 5 decades in active field work, stood at the threshold of his final chapter in 2001, when stroke marked the beginning of a decline he would face with characteristic courage. The stroke that Ed Warren suffered in 2001 did not end his work. It transformed it. The man who had spent 50 years walking into haunted houses, conducting interviews with terrified families, performing investigations in locations where others refused to enter, now faced a different kind of challenge. His body, weakened by age and the cumulative toll of a lifetime spent in spiritual combat, no longer permitted the physical demands of active field investigation. But his mind remained sharp. His analytical capacity, honed across thousands of cases, stayed intact. His demonological knowledge, built through decades of study and practical application, continued to function with the precision that had made him the consultant of choice for clergy-facing cases beyond their experience. Lorraine understood what needed to happen. She became the primary field investigator during these final years, conducting the on-site work that had always been the foundation of Warren methodology, while Ed remained the analytical anchor, providing the assessment and classification that turned raw observation into actionable understanding. The cases that came to the NESBR during the final years reflected the full spectrum of phenomena that had characterized the Warren career from its beginning. Residual hauntings in historic New England properties arrived regularly, brought by homeowners who had exhausted conventional explanations for the footsteps in empty hallways, the voices in locked rooms, the apparitions that appeared with predictable regularity in locations where tragedy had occurred generations earlier. Poltergeist manifestations in suburban households came from families whose peaceful lives had been disrupted by phenomena that escalated from minor disturbances to violent physical attacks. And the cases that had always defined the most serious dimension of Warren work continued to arrive with disturbing frequency. Reports of demonic infestation, oppression, and possession that required not merely investigation, but spiritual intervention of the most serious kind. The Warren reputation, built across 5 decades of documented work, continued to draw these cases from across the northeastern United States and beyond. Families in crisis, clergy confronting phenomena beyond their training, individuals experiencing attacks they could neither explain nor stop, all turned to the NESBR because the organization had demonstrated, across thousands of documented investigations, that it took seriously what others dismissed and possessed the knowledge and methodology to address it effectively. Lorraine Warren's fieldwork during this period carried the full weight of the methodology she and Ed had developed together. She arrived at investigation sites with recording equipment, cameras, interview protocols, and the psychic sensitivity that had always been her particular contribution to the partnership. She walked through disturbed properties with the calm professionalism of someone who had done this thousands of times before, noting cold spots, identifying areas of concentrated activity, sensing the presence of entities that others could only infer from physical effects. She interviewed witnesses with the pastoral gentleness that came from understanding how terrifying these experiences were for people encountering them for the first time, while simultaneously maintaining the investigative rigor necessary to separate genuine phenomena from misperception, psychological distress, or deliberate fabrication. She coordinated with clergy, arranging blessings, exorcisms, and other forms of spiritual intervention appropriate to the severity of each case, and she brought everything back to Ed. The documentation from the final years reflects this adapted working partnership with remarkable clarity. Lorraine's field observations appear in her own voice, recorded with the detailed precision that Ed had taught her to maintain from the beginning. Ed's analytical commentary follows, sometimes recorded weeks after the initial investigation, when his health permitted the concentration required for proper assessment. Together, these paired observations produce case files of continued depth and rigor, demonstrating that even in physical decline, the Warren methodology remained as effective as it had ever been. Ed's classifications of entities, distinguishing between residual hauntings and intelligent manifestations, between demonic infestation and full possession, between cases requiring simple blessing and those demanding formal exorcism, continued to guide the NESBR response to every investigation. His recommendations for appropriate spiritual intervention drew on a lifetime of accumulated knowledge about what worked and what did not, which prayers proved effective in which circumstances, which ritual approaches produced resolution, and which merely provoked escalation. In the cases where Ed Warren's physical condition permitted his direct presence during these final years, those who witnessed his arrival described an experience of particular gravity. The man who came to investigation sites in his late 70s was recognizably the same person who had walked into haunted houses as a young man with a painting under his arm, hoping to sell his artwork while satisfying his curiosity about the supernatural. The curiosity remained unchanged. The theological framework had deepened, refined by decades of experience into something more nuanced and more certain simultaneously. And the fundamental conviction that this work mattered, that families in spiritual crisis deserved help, that demonic forces required opposition, that the reality of the supernatural had implications for how people understood their lives and their faith, burned as brightly as it had in 1952 when he and Lorraine had founded the NESBR with nothing but their shared commitment and their determination to pursue truth wherever it led. Lorraine, who had become the more publicly visible face of the partnership during the final decades, managed the lecture appearances and media interviews that Ed's declining health made increasingly difficult. She appeared at conferences, universities, and paranormal events, presenting the Warren findings with the authority of 50 years' direct experience. She spoke about the cases that had defined their career, Amityville, Annabelle, the Snedeker House, Harrysville, with the careful precision of someone who understood that every word would be scrutinized, challenged, and in many cases disbelieved. She faced skeptics with patient courtesy, neither defensive nor aggressive, simply presenting what she and Ed had documented and allowing audiences to draw their own conclusions. And she continued to accept new cases, bringing the complete Warren methodology to bear on every investigation the NESBR undertook regardless of whether it would ever receive public attention. The dangers that Ed and Lorraine Warren faced during the final period of their active collaboration extended beyond the paranormal phenomena they investigated. The physical toll of 5 decades spent in intensive investigation work, the sleepless nights in disturbed properties, the psychic exposure to powerful adversarial presences, The emotional weight of sustained pastoral engagement with families experiencing genuine spiritual crisis represented a cumulative burden that both investigators carried in ways their public presentations largely concealed. Ed Warren's stroke, while marking the visible beginning of his physical decline, was not the first health event that the career had visited upon him. The stress of confronting demonic entities, the exhaustion of maintaining investigation schedules that often ran continuously for weeks during active cases, the psychological impact of sustained exposure to human suffering at its most extreme, all exacted costs that only became fully apparent in retrospect. Lorraine Warren spoke in later interviews about the spiritual protection that she and Ed maintained as the single most important factor enabling them to conduct this work without becoming casualties of the forces they engaged. Their daily mass attendance was not a peripheral religious practice, but a foundational necessity. Their sustained prayer life, which included specific protective prayers before, during, and after every investigation, functioned as the defensive perimeter without which the work would have been impossibly dangerous. The formal spiritual support of the clergy with whom they worked closely, priests who understood the reality of what the Warrens confronted and provided sacramental protection through confession, communion, and blessing, represented the ecclesiastical framework that made their direct engagement with adversarial entities survivable. Ed Warren's assessment was unambiguous. Without these protections, the investigation work they conducted would have been simply too dangerous for sustained pursuit. The forces they confronted were real, intelligent, and actively hostile. Approaching them without spiritual armor was not bravery, but foolishness. The resolutions achieved in the final Warren investigations reflected the full depth of methodology that 5 decades of active work had refined. Cases that would have challenged the young couple in the 1950s, when they were still learning to distinguish between different categories of phenomena and developing the investigation protocols that would define their career, were addressed by the mature Warren organization with confidence grounded in comprehensive documentation. Every new case had analogs in the NESBR archive. Every manifestation had precedent. Every entity fit patterns that thousands of previous investigations had established. This accumulated knowledge translated into effective intervention. The Warrens knew what worked because they had tried everything and documented the results. The clergy network that Ed and Lorraine had built across 5 decades gave them access to ecclesiastical authority at the highest levels available within the Catholic tradition. This access proved decisive in the most serious cases. The difference between a bishop-authorized formal exorcism and a parish-level house blessing was, in Warren assessment, genuinely significant when dealing with powerful demonic entities. Ed's decades of relationship building with sympathetic clergy, his careful documentation that provided evidence supporting requests for major exorcism, and his reputation for theological seriousness had given the NESBR access to intervention categories that most lay investigators could never obtain. The final cases benefited from this accumulated relational capital in ways that sometimes made the difference between resolution and continued oppression for the families involved. Ed Warren participated in his final active consultation on a case investigation in 2005, approximately 1 year before his death. The case was not a public one. The family involved was not identified in any SBR documentation. The circumstances were not dramatized for media consumption, but the assessment Ed Warren provided from his Monroe home, delivered with the same analytical precision that had characterized 5 decades of casework, resulted in an intervention that resolved the situation the family had brought to his attention. It was a fitting final contribution, quiet, effective, focused entirely on helping people rather than on recognition or fame. Ed Warren passed away on August 23, 2006, at his home in Monroe, Connecticut, at the age of 79. Lorraine Warren survived him by 13 years, continuing to consult on cases, supporting the work of the NESBR under the direction of their son-in-law Tony Spera, and serving as consultant to the film productions that brought the Warren legacy to global audiences through the Conjuring franchise. She died on April 18, 2019, at the age of 92, in the Monroe home she had shared with Ed, and where so much of their life's work had been planned, conducted, and documented. They are buried together in Stepney Cemetery in Monroe, Connecticut. The location is significant. Stepney Cemetery is the very site they had investigated and written about, the location of the White Lady apparition they had documented across decades, the old New England burial ground that is now also the resting place of the most significant paranormal investigators in American history. Their grave has become a destination for those who wish to remember them. Visitors leave tokens, prayers, expressions of gratitude for the work the Warrens did and the courage they demonstrated in doing it. The legacy they left is substantial and multifaceted. The case files of the NESPR, numbering in the thousands, represent the most comprehensive documentation of paranormal phenomena assembled by any single organization in American history. The books they wrote, accounts of their most significant investigations, theological reflections on the nature of demonic activity, practical guides for those encountering the supernatural, continue to be read by new generations seeking to understand what Ed and Lorraine spent their lives investigating. The lectures they gave at hundreds of university campuses introduced countless students to the possibility that the universe contained more than materialist philosophy acknowledged. And the films that dramatized their most famous cases, whatever their relationship to strict documentary accuracy, brought the Warren names and the Warren conviction to audiences numbering in the hundreds of millions worldwide. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Warren legacy is the simple insistence, maintained across 5 decades of active work, that the paranormal was not merely entertainment, but a genuine dimension of human spiritual experience, requiring courage, discernment, and faith to engage honestly. Ed and Lorraine Warren never claimed to have all the answers. They acknowledged the limits of their knowledge and the mysteries that remained even after 50 years of investigation. But they insisted that the questions were real, that the phenomena were real, that the danger was real, and that people experiencing these things deserved to be taken seriously rather than dismissed, ridiculed, or abandoned to face the darkness alone. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.